The 50s, where contactees met with denizens of other worlds, usually from our solar system, who brought messages of peace and love. But I'm going to be talking about the 40s, and 2 UFO related deaths which bring us face to face with weather balloons, ghosts, werewolves and death by UFO. Probably the most well-known UFO-related death has to be the incident involving Captain Thomas Mantell. Mantell was an experienced pilot with over 2,000 hours of flying time and had received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his part in the Battle of Normandy in France during World War II, and was at the time of the incident serving as a Kentucky National Guard pilot with the 165th Fighter Squadron. On January the 7th, 1948, accompanied by 3 other National Guard planes, Mantell was piloting his P-51 Mustang fighter in the skies above Kentucky. At approximately 1:30 p.m, Kentucky State Police and Godman Airfield at Fort Knox began receiving reports of a white circular object about a quarter the size of the moon flying over the city of Mansville. Observers at Clinton County Airfield said the object had the appearance of having a flaming red cone with trailing green mist. In Ohio, Lockburn Army Airfield had observed the object being very close to the ground for 10 seconds before climbing back to its original altitude of about 10,000 feet and moving at a high rate of speed, disappearing into the overcast skies at a speed of around 500 miles per hour. In a matter of minutes, the area of the sightings expanded to cover Irvington and Owensboro. After around 60 minutes from the first report, Mantell's group was asked to investigate the strange object that had been observed. Here's the actual transcripts. Godman Tower calling the flight of 4 ships northbound over Godman Field, do you read? Over. Godman Tower calling the flight of 4 ships northbound over Godman Field, do you read? Over. Roger, Godman Tower, this is National Guard 869, flight leader of the formation, over. National Guard 869 from Godman Tower, we have an object out of south of Godman here that we're unable to identify, and we would like to know if you have gas enough and if you could take a look for us if you will. Roger, I have the gas and I will take a look for you if you give me the correct heading. One of his 3 companions was low on fuel and had to return to base. Mantell led the way, climbing to 15,000 feet. Once reaching that height, he radioed the control tower and reported, "The object is directly ahead of me and above me now, moving at about half my speed. It appears to be a metallic object or possibly a reflection of sun from a metallic object, and it's of tremendous size. I'm still climbing. I'm trying to close in for a better look." This statement has been refuted by some for many years. Now, these old World War II fighters were not built for high altitude flights as they were not equipped with oxygen. One of the pilots, Lieutenant Albert Clemens, did have an oxygen mask, but it had little in the oxygen supply, so he and another pilot, Lieutenant Hammond, broke off the encounter at around 22,000 feet, leaving Mantell to continue the pursuit alone. At around 25,000 feet, according to the Air Force, Mantell passed out due to lack of oxygen and his plane spiralled down, crashing on a farm belonging to William J. Phillips in Franklin, Kentucky. Mantell's body was pulled from the wreckage and his wristwatch had stopped at 3:18, the time of the crash, and the UFO was nowhere to be seen. It's been mentioned that although he was a seasoned pilot, he was actually new to the flying of the P-51, but that wouldn't explain about breaking the golden rule of not flying above 15,000 feet without oxygen. As ever, nothing ever seems to be straightforward. Rumours began to spread that Mantell's body wasn't even found in the plane, that the UFO was a Russian missile, the plane had in fact exploded and disintegrated in midair, or Mantell's body was riddled with bullets, aliens had disabled his aircraft because it got too close. The investigating officer at the time, head of Blue Book, Captain Edward Ruppelt, in his book The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, said he had heard these rumours and in 1952 wired for a copy of the accident report. The report said that the F-51 had lost a wing due to excessive speed in a dive after Mantell had blacked out due to the lack of oxygen. Mantell's body had not burned, it had not disintegrated and was not full of holes. The wreck wasn't radioactive and nor was it magnetised. He also wondered why Mantell, a seasoned pilot who, like other pilots, had had it knocked into him for not going above 15,000 feet without oxygen, yet he had clearly done so. A lifelong friend of Mantell's went on record saying, and I quote, he couldn't conceive of Mantell even thinking about disregarding this lack of oxygen. Mantell was one of the most cautious pilots that he knew. The only thing I can think, he commented, was that he was after something that he believed to be more important than his life or his family. The media, of course, had a field day with headlines such as "Flyer dies chasing a flying saucer" and "Plane exploded over Kentucky as that and near states report a strange object." A year after the incident, the Air Force released its official report that basically said that Mantell had died after losing control of his plane through oxygen deprivation after chasing Venus or a balloon, possibly two balloons. Newspaper writers were allowed to question a major, who was an expert on UFOs at the Pentagon, about the report, who, when asked flatly, stated it was Venus. They checked it again and it was Venus. But he had no idea who they were who checked it, but it was definitely Venus. In 1952, whilst conducting his own investigations, Ruppelt spoke to astronomer, astrophysicist and Blue Book consultant J. Allen Hynek, who had done extensive work on the Mantell case originally. Hynek said that although Venus was in the direction, it wasn't bright enough to be seen. It was only a tiny bright pinpoint of light impossible to find on a clear day, let alone a slightly overcast one. Godman Base Commander Guy F. Hicks stated to reporters that he had watched the object for around an hour with binoculars and would not have confused what he saw with the planet Venus. The balloon theory also took a bit of a kicking after discovering that no balloon was launched or could have been in the skies that day. Richard T. Miller, who was in the operations room of Scott Air Force Base in Belleville, Illinois, stated that he was monitoring the radio talk between Captain Mantell and Godman Tower, and Mantell quite clearly said, "My God, I see people in this thing." He also stated that later that evening officers from the Air Technical Intelligence Centre out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base arrived and ordered all personnel to turn over any materials relating to the crash. In 1997, more information came to light when Captain James F. Dusler, a military officer at Godman who had retired and was then living in England, he stated that he and several other officers actually observed the objects on the day as it hovered over Godman Airfield. He said the UFO was a strange grey looking object which looked like a rotating inverted ice cream cone. Dusler was both a pilot and also an air crash investigator who shortly visited the site. He stated, "The wings and tail section had broken off on impact with the ground and were a short distance from the plane. There was no damage to the surrounding trees and it was obvious that there had been no forward or sideways motion when the plane had come down. It just appeared to have belly flopped into the clearing. There was very little damage to the fuselage, which was in one piece, and no signs of blood whatever in the cockpit. There was no scratching on the body of the fuselage to indicate any forward movement, and the propeller blade bore no telltale scratch marks to show that it had been rotating at the time of the impact, and one blade had been embedded into the ground. The damage pattern was not consistent with an aircraft of this type crashing at high speed into the ground. Because of the large engine in the nose of the plane, it would come down nose first and hit the ground at an angle. Even if it had managed to glide in, it would have cut a swathe through the trees and a channel into the ground. None of these signs were present. All indications were that it had just belly flopped into the clearing. I must admit, I found this very strange. What did Captain Thomas Mantell chase on that fateful day in 1948? J. Allen Hynek was certain that it couldn't have been Venus, and records show that it was certainly not a balloon as none had been launched. The super secret Skyhook archives had never been found to show a launch on these dates, and members of the project for Skyhook remember operating out of nearby Clinton County Air Force Base in 1947, but refused to say if they launched anything on that date. Mantell obviously died chasing something. As to what? It's just another one of those UFO mysteries. Before I get to the next bit, please help me by liking, subscribing and telling your friends. Please click the buttons below. Thank you. It's times like this that I wish I had a voice like Twilight Zone's Rod Serling. He was able to lean against the wall or stand in a doorway and give a little bit of a story leading up to the main show with his wonderful engaging voice that invariably, or maybe not at all, started with "Picture this." Anyway, picture this. It's 1976 and a teenage boy has flown the flag in the face of adversity by showing up at school with a book on UFOs. Wishing to carry on his research in school breaks and running the risk of a good kicking by narrow-minded Neanderthals, he was quite surprised when a voice over his shoulder said, "UFOs, eh? My dad's into that." The next day the lad turned up with an issue of Flying Saucer Review that stepped his research up to the next level. Indeed, this was the case, for I was that guy who was sat against the wall reading the UFO books on his break, and the chap who brought the book in from his dad was a young lad called Alan Whitehead. He'd gone home, told his dad of my interest in UFOs, and his dad had sent me a random issue to read. For me, this was the holy grail of British ufology at the time. About 35p an issue that at the time I had other things to spend 35 pence on. Founded by ex-RAF pilot Derek Dempster in 1955 and edited up till 1959 by the 8th Earl of Clancarty, Brinsley Laporte Trench, and was certainly, in the years under Charles Bowen, one of the most respected journals regarding the subject of UFOs. But I digress. Once I'd got this book, I couldn't wait to get home to read it. There was no chance that I was chancing it at school because it would have been absolutely damaged if someone would have got hold of me. The issue was Flying Saucer Review, Volume 19, Number 2, March-April 1973, and I began reading with the foreword, where something caught my eye at the end of a paragraph. And I quote, "We propose to follow the advice of Amy Michelle, to look at everything, study everything, but believe nothing. When we receive reports of seemingly benevolent creatures or agencies, we shall print them accordingly. And when we have reports that point in exactly the opposite direction, we shall print them too, which is one reason why the account of the death of João Prestes of Araçariguama is included in this issue of Flying Saucer Review." Now that stopped me in my tracks. I mean, I'd heard of cattle mutilations and substantiated human mutilations too, but a death reported in such a revered tome such as Flying Saucer Review, wow. Sure enough, in the left column on page 14, the terrible death of João Prestes of Araçariguama by Professor Philippe Carrion. Now you may wonder why the big introduction to this case. Firstly, it gives me an excuse to tell you a little bit about myself in regards to how long I've been involved with the subject of UFOs, and secondly, to pad things out, as although it's an interesting case, there's not that much to say once you've been presented with the facts. In September 1971, during a private interview at the 4th Brazilian Conference on Unidentified Flying Objects between Professor Carrion and Dr. Irineu José de Silveira, the first pieces of an investigation of a case from some 25 years previously began to come together and was presented initially in the French publication Phénomènes spatiaux in December 1971. The incident took place on Shrove Tuesday in February 1946 in the small town of Araçariguama, Sao Paulo, Brazil. After a day's fishing on the nearby Tietê River near the small village of Araçariguama, João Prestes Filho and his friend Salvador dos Santos packed up their fishing gear and put it into their horse-drawn cart and set off home. Filho decided he would take his friend Santos home first, then bade him farewell and headed off homeward. Araçariguama was a poor town, and at the time had no electricity supply, no telephones, and was far removed from major roads. It consisted of a few small old houses, a diocesan church, and these were surrounding an unpaved open space. And so the journey home was in almost total darkness, and a lonely one, made even more so by the knowledge that his wife, 5 children and most of the village were celebrating a carnival in San Roque, about 7 miles away. Theo would much rather fish. Eventually reaching home, he discovered he could not get into the house as his wife had not left the key. He was tired, hungry and desperate to get in, and when he found an open window he decided that was his best option to gain entrance. Almost as soon as he had managed to squeeze through into his home, he felt as though he was being watched. He quickly looked out of the window to see if he was being watched. Instead of seeing anybody outside, what he did see was a glowing object which was just above, and it shot out a hot, bright light that hit his body. What happened lasted a few seconds and he felt the burning spreading throughout all of his body. Through the pain he managed to somehow open the front door and ran barefoot, because apparently he never wore any shoes, to his sister Maria's home. He reached there with bloodied feet that rocks had cut on the way, and he told his sister that he had been burned. The local police became involved, and shortly after, João Malakwi, the village police officer, arrived to investigate. Theo told him that there was no one to blame, as his attacker had not been from this world. At this point, people who were talking to Theo realised that the flesh around his leg was coming away from the bone and looked like meat that had been allowed to boil for a while. Around this time, members of Theo's family began to arrive and saw how gravely ill he looked, and that his normal fair skin looked a roasted red colour. His face was badly burnt, yet his hair seemed unaffected, and his hands were now burnt and deformed. He was also now unable to communicate properly, quite possibly because of the burn damage to his tongue. It would have been ideal to take Theo to Sao Paulo and get him to the main hospital, but the dangerous roads were deadly at night time, and so the police chief decided to take him to nearby Santa Casa Hospital in Santana de Parnaíba. With no ambulance, they were going to transfer him by using a truck, and at this point his body was truly ruinous and with serious burns all over. The doctors at the hospital were stumped over Theo's condition. Former army medic and orderly Araceli Gomide was with Theo in the last hours, describing that he was literally decomposing alive. Gomide did his best to comfort the swiftly deteriorating Theo and described the fisherman's horrifying last hours, during which chunks of flesh slewed off his arms, exposing portions of bone and tendon. This awful process also happened to the victim's face, as his ears, nose, lips and eyelids bit by bit peeled off, clinging to slender strands of skin before falling onto the bed. Eventually the tissue around his jaw fell away and he could no longer communicate. If these descriptions of his final hours are a true and accurate representation, then it must have been a torturous and agonising time for Theo. Within a short time, Theo died. The official medical cause was cardiac collapse as a result of generalised first and second degree burns. Which brings us to, what did kill João Priestes Theo? Some extreme ufologists are adamant that this is a definite extraterrestrial attack on a human being. Yet, for people from his village, that thought had never passed their minds. Remember, this was 1946, and almost a year before Kenneth Arnold's sighting that brought in the modern age of ufology, and the villagers would have no context to look at this as a UFO event. In fact, most suspected that the culprit for the attack was Boaitata, aka the Beatata, Beitata, Bitata, Batata, Batatau, Mboikasu, Mboitata, Mbeitata. This is from the now extinct Tupi language, once spoken by native Brazilians. It translates as fiery serpent. Apparently it's a malicious South American equivalent of the European sprite the will-o'-the-wisp. The Boitata would allegedly often pursue and even kill the native peoples. Apparently in his youth Theo had been attacked by a Boitata when he was younger. A fireball came from the skies, almost knocking him down. Theo's nephew thought there may be a family curse, as not long after Theo's death, his uncle Emiliano, Theo's brother, was attacked by a fiery torch in the nearby forest. The torch fell upon him and Emiliano prayed for his life and could feel the heat intensify, but it just lifted from him, moved away and vanished. Also, people would see 5 or 6 of these lights that would appear and explode and name them Boyatata lights. Back in 1993, a young girl by the name of Regina Barbosa da Silva saw a globe-like UFO that struck her with a powerful beam that caused her to have severe headaches. And also a few weeks after that, a couple of watchmen on the nearby Lila Ranch saw a couple of humanoids floating over a nearby brook. And the lights continue to be seen today. Another camp believed that Theo had become a victim of assombracos. These are ghosts that lived in the nearby long-closed Morro Velho gold mine, located on nearby Mount Sabayo. Maybe the ghosts of miners who died untimely deaths in the old Morro Velho mine. They look like glowing fireballs and are also known as the Mothers of Gold. Strangely enough, the deep forests of the Araçariguama and San Roque area seem to be the home of strange creatures. Lobisomem are often seen. These are like werewolves. The San Roque area is famous, or infamous, for reports of the chupacabra, the goat sucker, and has experienced one of the most intense waves of chupacabra activity in the whole of South America. In the 1940s, paranormal belief was pretty much the norm in rural Brazil, yet others have speculated that Theo may actually have been a victim of an atomic attack. Many years after the incident, Dr. Luis Braga was investigating the case and concluded that the burns were similar to, and I quote, the indirect effects of a nuclear explosion, as occurred with certain victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now let's look at this in context. The first recorded use of an atomic weapon was in August 1944 over Hiroshima. Now, as far as I'm aware, in 1946, and also present day for that matter, there are no ways we can project a precise irradiated beam of that intensity. And even if we were able to do this, why test it in the middle of nowhere on some poor unsuspecting fisherman? Or could it have been ball lightning? Ball lightning is a real yet mostly unexplained atmospheric electrical phenomenon that presents as luminescent spherical objects that vary from something the size of a large ball bearing to at least several metres in diameter. This phenomenon is said to last considerably longer than the split-second flash of a lightning bolt, but on rare occasions they've exploded with devastating results. Until recently, ball lightning wasn't accepted as a real phenomenon. Was Theo one of the few human beings to have been struck by this most mysterious of atmospheric phenomena, which leaves accidental death? There is a phenomenon called spontaneous human combustion that could possibly, and I do mean possibly, be the explanation for this incident, apart from the fact it would not explain the glowing orb that Theo initially seen, or the fact that he survived the initial event. During the 1960s, Brazilian ufologist Dr. Walter Buehler speculated that Theo's burns were possibly caused by an accidental fire, probably started by a candle. But for this to be the case, you would have to ignore the police report which shown that nothing had burned within Theo's home. Was this a way of putting some spin away from a negative extraterrestrial experience? Buehler was a member of a sect that believed that UFOs were in fact divine entities, so possibly murderous aliens was not something he would like to see bandied about. And even though weather reports and local villagers can attest that there were no storms of the night of the incident, there are still many debunkers that believe that Theo was just plainly struck by lightning. But wait, let's just have a think about the possibility of his death actually being caused by an extraterrestrial visitation. There have been violent or life-threatening UFO encounters. The Cash Landrum case, where the witnesses alleged they were victims of radiation burns from an Air Force escorted UFO. The Falcon Lake case, where a gentleman was burnt by a UFO exhaust. The Frederick Valentich case, a young Australian pilot who disappeared while radioing in about a strange object being on top of him. Thomas Mantell, of course, who we spoke about earlier. And the Gonzalez and Ponce case in Venezuela during 1954, where they were attacked by small hairy dwarf-like aliens who forcibly attempted to abduct them. But in a similar vein to what I stated earlier, why on earth would advanced extraterrestrials travel countless light years or hop dimensions to zap a poor fisherman with some impressive piece of technology and then nip off? The light beam and ball of light that burned Theo seems similar to the events that happened in the city of Corrales, Brazil in 1977, where many people were burned and in some instances killed by a laser type light. So much was going on that a huge investigation by the Brazilian Air Force was launched. I will be covering this investigation in a future show. Without any other proof save the testimony from the victim, we are left with what appears to be a death caused by a flying object of some kind. The Spanish UFO authority, Antonio Ribera, revealed that Theo may have in fact been burned by a propulsion system of a UFO that was flying by the Theo house. In a similar way that Stephen Michalak was burned by some exhaust port in the Manitoba Falcon Lake case, except where he was scarred, poor Theo was killed. If it was indeed some form of extraterrestrial accident, then let's hope that somewhere lessons have been learned. Because if it wasn't an accident, and an innocent human being was targeted and killed, what's to say that it couldn't happen again? See you next time on Worlds Beyond.